This section is going to have the metabolism of fat and how fat contributes to exercise performance. And so this is really the meat of the chapter, even though it's only 9 slides. Fat is broken down in the formation, or excuse me, in the process of beta oxidation, and beta oxidation is purely aerobic and it occurs in the mitochondria. It is a catabolic process where the fatty acids are broken down to generate acetyl-CoA, which then feeds directly into the citric acid cycle. And ultimately, the mass amount of energy is produced in the electron transport chain. This particular slide represents a cell, a healthy cell in a heart. And it shows the box, which is the cell membrane, and a couple receptors that are on the cell membrane. On the left, you'll see GLUT1 and GLUT4, and that is the transporter that brings glucose into the cytoplasm of the cell. This is where hexokinase, or HK, will act on that glucose and it'll become G6P. Structure changes slightly, and then the metabolism through glycolysis occurs. The end result of glycolysis is ATP and acetyl-CoA. Well, I should say ATP and pyruvate. Pyruvate can enter the mitochondria, or it can be reduced to lactate and acetyl-CoA, which enters the mitochondria. From that point, acetyl-CoA is now a substrate for the TCA or Krebs cycle. Fat, on the other hand, is brought into the cell membrane by a fatty acid translocase. And once it enters the cell, it can be converted to a triacylglyceride, so it's going to be in the pool, the triacylglyceride pool within the cell, or it can be converted and moved across the mitochondria, and now this fatty acid, long chain fatty acid, I will say, gets with the CoA, can get moved into the mitochondria, and that's where beta oxidation occurs. It's referred to as beta oxidation because the process of breaking down that fat is to break it down by not the alpha carbon, but the beta carbon. So it cuts at the beta carbon, and that is the second carbon. You end up with a 2-carbon molecule that can be converted into acetyl-CoA, and off it goes into the Krebs cycle. You'll also see that the beta oxidation produces these transporters, this NADH and FADH2, which are going to be transported to the electron transport chain to ultimately produce ATP. So we have two things going on here, and that's why it's often identified that fats burn in a carbohydrate flame. It's because Krebs cycle is really powered by carbohydrates, and many of the intermediate components in that Krebs cycle do involve a carbohydrate skeleton. Fat can only go through metabolism if it goes through the Krebs cycle, and that's really how we start to use that fat. Now keep in mind that the Krebs cycle is an aerobic cycle and it requires oxygen. So what we should gather from that as well is that fat metabolism must be aerobic to occur. So think about when somebody is at a high intensity of exercise and they become more anaerobic in metabolism, that fat is not going to be a preferred fuel because it needs oxygen to be utilized. This shows you the fat metabolism during exercise of sources of where fat can come from. So we have our adipose tissue in the stored triglycerides, and you'll see that is a lot of calories, 50 to 100,000 calories, and this is just in your reference person. That will change based upon a person's body fat. Those free fatty acids can be released. They get into the blood or into the plasma, and here is this protein albumin. Albumin is this great big bus that is important for carrying free fatty acids. It makes it soluble, and so that's how fats can be transported through the blood, is that it gloms onto that protein and becomes soluble. Now, albumin can go ahead and release that free fatty acid, and it can cross over into the muscle cell. Remember, there's a specific transporter that does that. Fatty acid translocase, I think it is. You'll see that those fatty acids now are in the cytoplasm. And look above that, there is a lot in your muscle itself. So you have adipose resources of triacylglycerides, and you have intramuscular sources of triacylglycerides. Not quite as many, but it's deposited in little droplets in the cell, and they're pretty snuggled next to the mitochondria. The glycogen will be broken down in your muscle cell. Ultimately, both of those fatty acids and the glycogen produce that acetyl-CoA. What's not shown is glycolysis, and actually the breakdown of glycogen, which is another step, into the Krebs cycle, into electron transport system. So you have this back and forth, or this pool of fatty acids that are in the adipose tissue, and we also have some fatty acids that are in the intramuscular or in the muscle cell. And when they're broken down to be utilized for fuel, the glycerol backbone is released into the plasma, and it can be utilized as fuel later on as well. This slide shows the breakdown of fat from adipose tissue, which is the top left, and skeletal muscle, which is in the bottom center. So lipolysis, or the breakdown of fat within the, the cell, involves some enzymes which are involved in speeding up that reaction. Hormone-sensitive lipase is active in the lipid cells, but it's also the primary enzyme breaking down lipids in the skeletal muscle. The glycerol and free fatty acids will then be transported into the blood and move to the working muscles, as you see here. In the reference individual, the reference man, 80 kilogram man with 15% body fat, there's about 12 kgs of fat, or fat in the skeleton, in adipose tissue, and there's about 0.3 kilograms of fat that's interspersed within the muscle. And when you look at steak, for example, there's marbling. It's kind of the same sort of intermuscular fat that we see in skeletal muscle. This picture shows the contribution of major fuel substrates after 30 minutes of exercise at different intensities. So we have 25% VO2 max, 65, and 85. You'll see that the energy contribution is represented by the size of the colored bar, the color within each bar. So at 25% of VO2 max, the energy expenditure is much lower than if you were at 85%. So the energy expenditure bar is small. The 65 represents more moderate exercise intensity, and 85 is more vigorous exercise intensity. So the green on the bottom shows the role of plasma glucose after 30 minutes of exercise, how it is contributing to energy production. Plasma free fatty acids, you'll see, are quite prevalent, the primary exercise fuel at low energy intensity, but it decreases in contribution both in perspective of percentage and also absolute value. The blue is the triglycerides, and the triglycerides are primarily focused or contributing at 65%. And finally, you'll see that muscle glycogen, there's a very small sliver that's at 25%, but it becomes the predominant energy source at high intensity exercise. So it's the preferred energy source at high intensity exercise. Now, when exercise begins, the increase in calcium and epinephrine trigger these enzymes to bring the breakdown of not only to activate carbohydrate metabolism, but also to activate beta oxidation or fat metabolism. Here we see on the left an expanded view of the sources of fat during different intensities. And this again is in fasted individuals after 30 minutes. So where do we use most of our fat? What in terms of the contribution of fat at just a walk is primarily plasma-free fatty acids. So it gets taken from the blood into the cell, ultimately into the mitochondria, where it is utilized aerobically. Intramuscular, very small contribution. When you get to more moderate exercise intensity, we have a greater energy expenditure and also a greater contribution of intramuscular triglycerides to the energy production. And as you would anticipate, as I indicated in the previous slide, at 85% of VO2 max, you have a greater reliance on carbohydrate, a less or lower reliance on fat. You're still getting utilization of both stores, but you'll see that progressively the plasma-free fatty acid contribution goes down as the intensity increases, and the intramuscular triglycerides are contributing less than the moderate intensity exercise, but it still is contributing quite a bit. This last picture shows what happens with training. And here we have the same exercise intensity, and it's if the person exercises at the same intensity of 65% of their maximum capacity before training, this is their reliance of energy. So major component is carbohydrate, intramuscular, followed by plasma-free fatty acid. Well, what happens when you exercise at that same given intensity of 64% of their pre-training? You end up having a much greater contribution of intramuscular triglycerides and a change. It's significantly different metabolism in each one of these components. I'm going to show you in the next slide. It'll be a little bit more, a little different way of looking at it. How does energy change, or fat utilization in particular, change as energy, as the exercise duration becomes extended? Well, if we look at the full contribution of carbohydrates and fats that lasts up to 2 hours, you'll see that about 40% of your energy expenditure is fats, a little less, with the majority of it being the green or the plasma-free fatty acids. The white is the intramuscular triglycerides. Carbohydrates become the biggest contributor, and glycogen being the gray and the black being blood glucose, we have quite a reliance on glycogen, and also blood glucose is still a source. And that's where our liver comes into play with keeping our blood glucose levels steady. If you increase your exercise above 2 hours, we see that the contribution of fat in particular the plasma-free fatty acids increase in terms of percentage of total used. There's less glycogen available, so there's less reliance on glycogen, and blood glucose stays the same. So we see a kind of a switch in what we use. Are we utilizing the glycogen, plasma-free fatty acids? Less, it's different when you get to how it contributes for longer duration. And I really like this picture at the bottom because it visually shows very cleanly, but it's not quite straight lines, but line of best fit, that as you increase exercise at moderate or vigorous intensity, that muscle glycogen contribution decreases. Blood glucose will increase reliance for that carbohydrate metabolism. And here we have plasma-free fatty acids in yellow being a bigger contribution and increasing in contribution as exercise duration becomes extremely long. Fat intake before exercise, and this is before, and then we'll look at during, and then we'll look at after. There really isn't a clear recommendation about taking a high-fat diet, that a high-fat diet either long-term or even short-term is beneficial. With short-term, if you increase the fat content, can you turn that the fat metabolism machinery on more? Can it become more efficient? Can you make a greater reliance on fat metabolism? Well, the problem is that fat adaptation does not really show us an improvement in duration or time to fatigue. So it doesn't appear to be beneficial. A single high-fat pre-competition meal can cause a lot of gut problems, and it really is something that has not been beneficial for athletes to do. Now, it used to be what people did. Used to think that you had to have a high protein, and which often meant to be resulted in a high fat diet the night before an exercise, but it's a performance, and that's been debunked. The recommendations are to really keep your fats to a minimum before exercise, and if anything, you want to experiment with it. There seems to be a potential. Each person has their unique metabolism in terms of their state of training, and it's important to recognize that and to experiment with it. But overall, there really is not any indication that high fat before exercise is going to result in benefits for performance. What about during exercise? Well, during exercise, researchers have looked at the source of fats. Well, we know that our free fatty acids, our blood fatty acids, are going to be the bigger contributor. Well, what if we monitor the type of fat that's consumed? Well, long-chain fatty acids are absorbed really slowly, and at lower intensity exercise and at rest, it seems to be a good source, but we know that as we extend our duration, that we have a greater reliance on our carbohydrates. So unless we go to that 4 hours, right? The medium chain fatty acids seem to be absorbed more quickly. However, there's limited research that shows that it's beneficial in humans, especially for endurance performance. So there was some work that was done about taking medium chain fatty acid supplements, about how they were really helpful for promoting fat metabolism. But in terms of performance and taking them during exercise, it seems questionable, and it's likely that it might cause some sort of gastric upset for the athlete. So it is not overall generally a recommendation. So fats during exercise have not been shown to be helpful. After exercise, is when, if you remember, if we look at endurance exercise, the goal is primarily getting that carbohydrate tank refilled. And so if you want to get your carbohydrate tank refilled, we don't really have a desire to refill our fat stores. That's not a difficult thing to do or what most people have issues with. We really want to get that carbohydrate filled. So it's more important to focus on those carbohydrates and some protein as the predominant sources of fuel during, or excuse me, post-exercise. And remind you that the carbohydrate storage is really at its highest point the first couple hours after exercise, and that's where we had those carbohydrate drinks that will help with hydration and also the storage of carbohydrates in the form of glycogen.